Good afternoon. For all of you lawyers who sometimes wonder why many of us have stayed on campus all of our lives, look outside today. This kind of setting and what we're going to be able to do here the next couple hours inside are a pretty good combination for how one can spend his or her life. The beauty of a college campus like this one in the spring, mostly coupled with the intellectual curiosity and the challenges that I think we'll explore the next couple hours, gives a lot of us, I think, a very good reason for being. And we're particularly honored that each one of you would take the time to come this afternoon and to share in the 97th Sibley lecture sponsored by the School of Law. I've said on many occasions, and not just when my colleagues on the law faculty are present, that this is clearly one of the gems in the crown at the University of Georgia. The School of Law for many, many decades has been producing this state's leaders. It continues to do so in a magnificent way, and we will indeed hear from some of those very, very successful graduates of the School of Law this afternoon. When I look back at growing up as I did in the state of Georgia, I'm convinced that one of the most significant events, and clearly one of the most significant rulings in American history, was the Brown versus Board of Education decision. It's one whose ramifications are still being felt today, as the recent public reaction to faculty deliberations on diversity at UGA have shown, as the circumstances that we went through a couple years ago with the 11th Circuit has demonstrated, and clearly as the Michigan case this year further indicates, the quest for proper balance between creating and honoring all people equally and providing access to people of all backgrounds and ethnicities in an appropriate fashion is one issue with which our society continues to struggle. It was almost a decade after Brown before the University of Georgia admitted its first African American student. And today we are privileged to admit some of the finest and best prepared African American students, certainly in this region of the country, and I believe anywhere. And yet the challenge to be even more broadly accepting in our admissions policies within the context of the law is one that we face daily. The public school system in this state, I believe, continues to struggle in many ways with the implications of the court's ruling. As we stand here today now, 50 years after Brown, while much progress has been made, I suspect that most, if not all of us in the room would agree that much remains to be done. And perhaps the best personification of the value of that decision is when we hear from people like the one from whom we will hear this afternoon. Our guest speaker, Chester Davenport, I think knows more about the struggle than most of us who are here today. And as the first African American graduate of the School of Law, I think he offers us today the rare privilege of being in the presence of a pioneer in America's great struggle for civil rights. I had a phone conversation just yesterday with former Governor Barnes, and he mentioned to me that one of the proudest days in his term as governor was the time that we stood together just two buildings down and dedicated the building that we dedicated in honor of both Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter. So the implications many years after this decision continue, and how we move effectively to deal with the challenging issues that still spring from that decision 50 years later will, I believe, continue to be one of our challenges in the 21st century. I think we're very fortunate today to have someone of Dean Rebecca White's talent leading the law school through the challenges that it faces both within this context and equally important within the context of superior academics. Dean White is a specialist in the areas of labor law, employment discrimination, and labor arbitration, and she has on many occasions been a favorite and yet demanding professor for many UGA law students. In the year 2000, she received the Josiah Meigs Award, the highest honor that UGA presents for teaching excellence. With graduates like Mr. Davenport and with leaders like Dean White, I truly believe that the future of the law school and its role as a leading school in this university is secure. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome each one of you, and now especially to welcome to the podium Interim Dean White, who will introduce our distinguished speaker. Rebecca.
Thank you, Dr. Adams. In a recent article published in the Journal of College and University Law, author Jason Marks notes that even today, only a handful of elite law schools are enrolling first-year law classes that are at least 10% African American in composition. The schools he identifies, classified as elite based on their selectivity or U.S. News and World Report rankings, are Columbia, the University of Pennsylvania, Vanderbilt, Southern California, George Washington, and the University of Georgia. I say this not to suggest that our law school should be self-congratulatory or complacent. It should not be. My point is that the University of Georgia has made important strides since 1963, when Chester Davenport enrolled as a first-year law student. Mr. Davenport's steps into our school opened the door for so many others who followed him, and we are grateful that you chose to study in our law school. Mr. Davenport, as Dr. Adams just said, was our first African American law student. Moreover, he was the only African American law student during all of his 3 years of law school. Mr. Davenport was an honors graduate of Morehouse College, president of his college fraternity, and a writer for the school newspaper. When he made the decision to attend law school, he returned to his hometown of Athens. Professor Werner Chafin was then chair of the Law School Admissions Committee, and he is here with us today. The Admissions Committee, which also consisted of Professor Meade Field and Professor John Reese, admitted Mr. Davenport without fanfare, as Professor Chafin put it. However, I can only imagine how difficult that transition into our law school must have been, and the determination and courage it must have taken to enroll here as the lone African American student in 1963. But I know that, despite what must have been difficult situations, Mr. Davenport succeeded in the classroom and outside of it. He was an editor of the Georgia Law Review, serving on the editorial board of Volume 1 of the Georgia Law Review. He was Chief Justice of the Law School's Honor Court, and he made many friends, close friends. In the words of his classmate Pat Rice, Chester Davenport easily became the most popular guy in our law school class. Indeed, some of his former classmates are here with us today. Mr. Davenport's career since leaving our school has been remarkable and varied. He began his career as an attorney in the tax division of the U.S. Department of Justice. He then became a legislative assistant to U.S. Senator Alan Cranston. He then left that post to become vice president and general counsel of the R.H. Lapin Company, an affiliate of Solomon Brothers in San Francisco. He served as an assistant secretary of transportation in the Carter administration, as chairman of GTE Consumer Services and of Envirotes Systems Corporation. He was a partner in a Washington, D.C. law firm, managing partner of First City Properties, a commercial real estate development partnership. In 1987, he founded Georgetown Partners, a private merchant banking firm located in Bethesda, Maryland, where he presently serves as managing director. In preparing for these remarks, I found a letter from then UGA Law Dean Lindsay Cowan to the Chief Counsel of the Internal Revenue Service. In that letter, which was in response to a letter of praise from the IRS for Mr. Davenport's performance as a summer clerk, and yes, law students, your employers do write you a dean and let us know how you're doing. Dean Cowan states about then 3L Chester Davenport, quote, "We believe Mr. Davenport has great ability and will be a credit to us in the years ahead." As my daughter would say, sure enough, or well duh. Indeed, he has been a credit to us and a role model for our students, and we are pleased and proud to have him here today to deliver our Sibley lecture. Mr. Davenport.
Wow, thanks, thanks for that warm introduction, Dean White. My only concern about it is that reading my bio, it sounds like I had a difficult time keeping a job. The two Dean White and obviously President Adams and Professor Sintel and Professor Chafin, and I understand Judge Ward and Justice Benham will be here, so to them. To my classmates who are here, Judge Fitzpatrick, Judge Crumley, Justice Underwood, and Judge Corsi, and one who, for some reason, they kept from being a judge, Archie Smith. And in case I forgot anyone, you know, as we used to say in the Baptist church, to all the saints and sinners present, I bring you greetings from Washington, D.C., and I'm honored that you've invited me to be your 97th Sibley lecturer. When we first moved to Washington, we were living in California. And my children were very small at that time. So I told my son, who was about 3 years old, that we were moving to Washington, D.C. So he walks out, and I see him, he's kissing the ground. He's saying, "Goodbye, ground. Goodbye, flowers. Goodbye, trees. Goodbye, God. We're moving to Washington, D.C." It is good to be back home in my beloved hometown of Athens, Georgia, on this beautiful spring day, and as President Adams said, on this beautiful campus. When I was asked to come down here to speak, I asked Dean White, what was I to speak about? And she said, "Speak about 30 minutes." Dean White called a few days ago, and she informed me that one of the professors that was still here, that taught me, was Perry Sintel, and that she thought it would be a good idea if I attended his tort class this morning. I said, "Dean, you know, I admire Perry Sintel. He's an excellent professor, and he's a friend of mine. But do I have to attend his tort class?" I agreed to attend kind of on one condition, is that if he didn't call upon me to ask me to explain Cardozo's ruling in Paulsgraf. Actually, I enjoyed the class, and most of all, I enjoyed seeing Professor Sintel in action again. I must admit that the biggest visible difference in the law school is the number of minority and women students in the school. As many of you know, I was not only the first African-American student to be admitted to the law school, but the only African-American student during my entire 3 years, as Dean White mentioned. So Boston meetings were easy. I always ran for office. and I always won with 100% of the vote. In retrospect, my years at Georgia were some of the most rewarding of my life. I greatly treasure the friends made during those years. I received a call on Monday from one of those friends who could not be here, Pat Rice, who Dean White mentioned. He said he heard that I was going to be the 97th Sibley lecturer and thought there was some mistake, since normally the school chose people of some international reputation, legal scholars, not some yokel Wall Street yokel like me. He said he wanted to make sure that I didn't embarrass our class, and I see a number of them here making sure that that doesn't happen. I said, Pat, trust me, everything will be okay. He said, yeah, okay. He said, but he made me promise to send him a copy of my remarks. He said he didn't want to read about them as usual when I'm saying bad things about them in the Wall Street Journal and New York Times. So I said, Pat, don't you trust me? He says, yeah, I trust you, but I share President Reagan's philosophy about the Russians. Trust but verify. Over the years, the question I'm asked the most often is, with all the turmoil and strife and violence and mass resistance to integration in 1963, why did you apply to the University of Georgia's law school? They asked, weren't you afraid? Was that the only school that you could get into? After all, they asked, weren't there riots and fires and death threats for Hamilton and Charlene? My answer to them, yes. But, well, why? Well, I had one simple answer for them. It was Horace Ward. When Judge Ward first applied to our law school, I was in the 4th grade at West Broad Elementary School. The fact that Judge Ward was denied admission to the law school was a big local and national story in Athens and across the state. So when I asked my teachers and parents why he could not attend the university, I was told they did not want black people at the University of Georgia unless they were cooks or waiters, not students. They told me that the state had agreed to pay his way to go up north to school, and that he could not stay at home like white students who wanted to go to the law school. At the tender age of 9, I thought that was not fair. I told my parents and teachers that if they had not let Horace Ward in Georgia by the time I got ready to go to law school, I was going to the University of Georgia. To my great surprise, 13 years later, I had the great pleasure of keeping that promise. And I want to thank Judge Ward for the courage that he showed and the inspiration that he gave to me. A few years after the University of Georgia denied Judge Ward's admission to our law school, the Supreme Court issued a decision that would change the landscape of this country forever. As you know, the case was Brown versus Board of Education. The court said in part, we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs and others similarly situated for whom the actions have been brought are by reason of the segregation complained of, deprived of the equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. This disposition makes unnecessary any discussion whether such segregation also violates the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Any person with a casual knowledge of the Constitution and the Queen's English would reasonably think that the court was clear on this issue, that segregated public schools were unconstitutional. However, 19 United States senators, 81 members of the House of Representatives did not quite understand. A few of them even studied in these hallowed halls. The response to the court's decision was the so-called Southern Manifesto, a document entered into the congressional record in 1956, which reads in part as follows. We regard the decision of the Supreme Court in the school cases as a clear abuse of judicial power. It climaxes a trend in the federal judiciary undertaken to legislate in derogation of the authority of Congress and to encroach upon the reserved rights of the states and the people. With the gravest concern for the explosive and dangerous conditions created by this decision and inflamed by outside meddlers. 9 years after the court's decision in Brown, I applied to the law school at the University of Georgia. I was informed in the spring of 1963 that I had been accepted to the law school. I had failed to inform my parents that I had even applied to the law school. So I gingerly approached them and said, Dad and Mom, I'm going to law school. That's wonderful. What are you thinking about going? I said, well, actually, I've been accepted at the University of Georgia. After they stopped yelling at me about not approaching them and at least sharing that decision, they were two very proud parents, and many of you here knew them. I must say that the African-American community in Athens, my former teachers, church members, and friends were very, very supportive, and I'm appreciative to them and indebted to them for that. For the students here, I think it is important to understand the context of the racial environment in Georgia during my years here. My first year at Georgia started in September of 1963. It was a time of turmoil regarding civil rights. The era of mass resistance was still reverberating throughout the South and Georgia. Ernie Vanderbilt was elected governor of Georgia on the campaign promise of no, not one. No, not one. I've continued to say it because he said it most 1,000 times. And he meant by that, no, not one African American will go to a public school in Georgia as long as I'm governor of Georgia. Well, that didn't happen. That stance, in my view, fueled ignorance, caused much hate, and incited violence, and was the main reason the riots occurred on this campus when Hamilton Holmes and Charlene Hunter were admitted as students. A few days before my first day at Georgia, Martin Luther King Jr. led his famous march on Washington, attended by 200,000 people. 2 weeks later, on the 15th of September, in Birmingham, Alabama, 6 little girls were killed by a bomb while attending Sunday school at the 16th Street Baptist Church. These were indeed troubling times. My first day as a law student at Georgia started out on the rocky side. I had lunch earlier today with some of my classmates, and we were discussing this particular incident. But I arrived at class early, as I recall, or maybe it was an indoctrination, as I recall, and there was no one there when I arrived, so I was busy kind of going through my papers, and as the students came in, I looked up and I noticed that there was no one within like 10 seats of me. I was kind of sitting out in the middle of this auditorium by myself. And I said, well, this is interesting, I thought. As the professor, to his credit, proceeded with the indoctrination without any comment. However, at my next class, which was 1 hour later, was not to begin that way. As we entered the classroom, the professor announced that there was a seating chart and that every student should walk up to the desk and see where his assigned seat is. So that ended that isolation. And every single professor adopted that seating chart. I knew at that moment that the law school and the administration and the faculty, by that act, had signaled to everyone their their stance and the university's stance on desegregation. After that incident, and over the next several months, I became friendly with some of my classmates. However, I believe the big icebreaker came at the conclusion of midterm exams in a course called Agency taught by the legendary Professor Field. As he passed out the exam results, he indicated that some people did not do well on the exams. And he suggested that they try to talk to people who did do well on the exams. Otherwise, they would flunk his class and probably end up selling law books rather than reading them. As it happened, I had one of the highest scores on the exam, and after that, I had many good friends. The period of adjustment that my classmates and I went through in the fall of 1963 was punctuated by a national tragedy, the assassination of President John Kennedy in November of that year. That tragedy shook the country and this campus. My classmates and I were brought closer together as we tried to comprehend what was happening to our country. The first year was the most difficult for all of us, not because necessarily only because of the integration issue, but because first year law school is just tough. It separates the wheat from the chaff, the boys from the Boy Scouts, or the girls from the Girl Scouts, or whatever you want to, analogy you want to think about. We were all very pleased when it was over. I was pleased not only because I had done reasonably well, but that I had made some friends in this process and that I had began to break the isolation that I had initially felt. As I started my second year, I was somewhat surprised that I was still the only African American in the law school. I really went over early to see the new students, and I thought, well, maybe I just missed these guys who are coming in, but so they really weren't there. So I thought, well, maybe they want to see what I do. Maybe if this guy graduates, maybe we can let somebody else in. I'm sure that wasn't the case, but that was what went through my mind. And the other thing that went through my mind is, well, there were other people, potential students, who thought that, well, there's this crazy guy over in Georgia, let's see how he survives over there before we go over there. So those kinds of thoughts went through my mind, and I just said, well, just like our guys down in the athletic department, maybe next year. During my second year at Georgia, the country was involved in a controversial war in Vietnam. The debate was over the war and its merits, and the fact that American resources were being wasted. We had a president from Texas. We were in a controversial war. We had a large budget deficit, and many questions were raised as to whether or not the truth had been told about how we got into the war. I can't imagine this happening today. For the most part, the classroom activities were fairly uneventful. But we did have a visiting professor that you all may recall from Yale. I believe he taught, it's Leach, I believe his name, personal future interest. He had a textbook or a casebook on future interest, and that was in property. And he was down from Yale. So we all, went to his class. He was a famous professor, had this book, we thought, and we were listening to him. So he comes into the classroom, and he starts out talking about future property interest. So he poses this question. He says, if A deeded property to B with the condition that if B deeded the property to a black person, it revert back to A. So he bellows out, "Mr. Davenport, what would you call that?" I said, "Well, I don't know what you all would call it up at Yale, but down here in Georgia, we would say it's unconstitutional." Leach never called on me again. However, at the end of the second year, it was nail-biting time again. Under the existing Georgia law, students who had completed their second year in law school were allowed to take the Georgia bar and be admitted, believe it or not, if they passed before completing the third year. Another challenge, I thought. After a thorough cram course at the law school in August of 1965, I, along with many of my classmates, took the Georgia bar exam in September. I thought that at least there would be some other African Americans beside me taking the bar exam. As we walked into the state capitol, there were 450, 500 people, and I was right. There was one more, so no, not one, but two. My third year, I thought, would be the charm. I looked forward to seeing the first class again, first year class, and meeting the new African American students. However, it was not to be. It was me, like it or not. During the fall of my third year, also, I was fortunate enough to be involved in the founding of the Georgia Law Review and to be a member of the editorial board, as Dean White mentioned. That was hard work, and I'm sure it still is. Another memorable event in our year was the military draft. That's alien to all of you young people, I know. But there was a draft. It means when a male reached a certain age, he had to register for the draft, and if he were called by his local selective service board, he had to go into the Army or the Marines or the Air Force or the Navy or whatever branch of service, but he had to go without any choice. So that was a very difficult time, particularly since 500 people a week were being killed in Vietnam. And you could be granted deferments for various things like going to law school. And I'm sure none of us went to law school just to avoid going to Vietnam. But be that as it may, we were granted a deferment. At the end of the third year, every male in the class, every person in the class, except Madge Field, who was the only woman in the class, was reclassified 1A, meaning that you were the top priority to be drafted. And so one day we were all over here, and they said, "Well, tomorrow you all not going to have class." We said, "Well, why?" "Well, there's a military bus coming over, and they're going to take everybody up to Fort McPherson, and you're going to take your medical exams to see if you're fit to be in the United States Army." As you can imagine, that was not quite what we all had in mind after 3 years in law school. Although there were different opinions about the war being right or wrong, I think we were all in full agreement that the members of the class of 1966 should not go to Vietnam. After all, we reasoned, why don't you send those guys in the Air Force National Guard? They know how to fly fighter planes. All we know how to do is write a Brandeis brief. Well, we took that trip to Atlanta, and believe it or not one of the members of the class was found to be physically fit to serve in the United States Army. It must have been all those midnight study sessions that we had. Back to the bar exam. As you can imagine, most of us were wondering about the results of the bar exam. We all thought that if we didn't pass, we could rationalize it by saying, well, we were only second-year students. Who expected us to pass anyway? It's just a practice test, right? Wrong. We all wanted to pass. Well, one day in early December, in the Atlanta Constitution on page 35, the headline read, 112 passed Georgia bar, 14%. I thought, oh my God, just 14%? I looked through the list. I did not see my name. I looked through the list again. I did not see my name. I looked through the list the third time, and finally I saw my name. They had my first name on one line and my last name on the next line. So as you can imagine, I was one happy third-year student. I couldn't wait to tell my father. When I told him that I had passed the bar exam, he said, "Well, I knew you were going to pass." I said, "Dad, I wish you had shared that with me." Those of us who passed the bar exam, we didn't waste any time in trying to, be sworn in and admitted to practice. That was, as I recall, it was a big swearing-in ceremony over in the state capitol to the Supreme Court, I believe in the Court of Appeals over there. And it was in the following January. And it so happened that that day, and the night before, we had a tremendous ice storm. And the governor had issued a decree that no one except official personnel should be out on the Georgia highways. Well, do you think that stopped us? No. A bunch of us got into a bunch of cars and proceeded down the Atlanta highway to the state capitol. Between sliding off the roads and watching for the Georgia State Patrol, we made it in 5 hours. Judge Griffin Bell, the former attorney general, who was a judge at that time in the federal courts, conducted the swearing-in ceremony. We were all, very kind of full of ourselves, being third-year law students, frankly, cocky third-year law students, still needing to graduate. Judge Bell was later appointed the Attorney General of the United States by President Carter, and he and I, over the years, became friends as we worked in the president's campaign together and served in the Carter administration in Washington. Being admitted to the Georgia bar was the second best day I had here. The best day was to come on June the 4th, 1966, at the University Coliseum when I received my LLB at the 163rd annual commencement of the University of Georgia. This time, my full name was on one line in the program. After receiving the diploma, I found my parents in the crowd and presented the diploma to them. They deserved it as much as I did. Since my days at Georgia, I've done a number of things as Dean White has listed. I thoroughly enjoyed being a young lawyer at the United States Department of Justice and serving as Assistant Secretary of Transportation in the Carter administration. My activities over the past 16 years have been devoted to Georgetown Partners, which is a private merchant banking firm we established in 1987. Over those years, we have bought and sold operating companies, financed those companies through IPOs and public debt financings. That crowd on Wall Street is tough, particularly the big-time investment bankers. The masters of the universe. As the story goes, they will make a deal with the devil himself. There was this investment banker who was having a bit of a tough time making partners. So one day the devil appeared to him. He said, "Young man, if you do what I ask you to do, you will become a partner. You will make $10 million a year." But the devil said, "There's a catch." He says, your parents will have an untimely death. Your firstborn will not make it 2 years. Your wife will leave you. So the investment banker says, "What's the catch?" No lawyer would make a deal like that, I'm sure, right? In a serious vein, I attribute whatever success I have achieved to my formative years at this law school. I was able not only to learn the law, but more importantly, learn to interact with people in difficult circumstances. I learned a lot from my classmates, and hopefully they learned a lot from me. My hope is that the students at the law school today will be as successful as we were in dealing with each other as human beings. Hopefully, you will take advantage of the opportunities that the diversity at this law school affords you. Hopefully, you will take this opportunity to understand each other and develop true, rewarding, and lifetime friendships as I did. Hopefully, you will focus on your similarities rather than your differences. If we could do that in 1963, it should be a piece of cake for you today. There are two thoughts I would like to leave you with, and I believe they reflect the attitude of our class and my attitude, and hopefully the attitude that you will adopt. And they come two quotes from two presidents. The first one is Calvin Coolidge. Nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination are omnipotent. The slogan, "Press on," has solved and always will solve the problems of the human race. No person has ever honored for what he received. Honor has been the reward for what he gave. The next quote is from Teddy Roosevelt. President Roosevelt said, "It is not the critic who counts, not the one who points out how the strong man stumbled or where the doers of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotion, and spends himself in a worthy cause, who knows best at the end the triumph of high achievement, and who, at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat." Thank you for inviting me here today.